Inside America's beer dynasty, the hidden secrets of the Bush family estate on a cold February morning in 1934, while most of St. Louis still slept under a blanket of Midwestern frost, a single gunshot shattered the silence inside one of America's most magnificent private estates. The sound did not echo through empty halls. It did not interrupt a gathering of strangers. It pierced the carefully constructed world of a family whose name had become synonymous with American celebration itself, a family that had turned hops and barley into an empire, immigrants into aristocrats, and a single brand of beer into a symbol recognized across the entire nation. The man who pulled the trigger was not a desperate criminal. He was not a rejected lover or a ruined gambler. He was August Anheuser Busch Sr., the president of the largest brewing company in the United States, a man whose signature appeared on paychecks for thousands of workers, whose decisions moved markets, whose mansion sat on land once walked by an American president. He was 69 years old. He was surrounded by luxury that most people could not even imagine. And he was dying in a way that money could not stop, in a way that power could not negotiate with, in a way that left him only one choice he could still control. The morning had started like so many others. His chauffeur, a man who had served the family for years, entered the bedroom at 8 o'clock sharp, the way he always did. He moved quietly, respectfully, carrying the routine of service that defined life in a house where even the smallest tasks were choreographed. He turned on the radio, hoping that music might cut through the thick silence that had settled over the room in recent weeks, hoping that sound might remind his employer that the world outside still turned, still celebrated, still drank the beer that bore his family's name. But before the music could fill the space, before the morning could settle into its familiar rhythm, the gunshot cracked through the air. Sharp, final, irreversible, the kind of sound that changes everything that comes after it. The chauffeur froze. Time collapsed. And in that instant, the man who had steered a brewing empire through the darkest period in American alcohol history, the man who had kept factories running when the law said beer was immoral, the man who had transformed his father's German immigrant dream into an American dynasty, made his exit from the world he had built. Beside the body lay a revolver, pearl-handled and elegant, the kind of weapon that matched the refined violence of a life lived at the top. And next to it a note, not a manifesto, not a long explanation filled with grievances and philosophical reflections, just a few words handwritten in a moment when clarity must have felt like the only thing left. Goodbye, precious mommy and adorable children. 2 words were underlined, as if August Sr. wanted to make absolutely certain they carried the weight he intended. Precious. Adorable. These were not the words of a man filled with rage or bitterness. These were the words of someone who still loved the people he was leaving behind, someone who could not bear to stay, but also could not bear to leave without telling them they mattered. The coroner's jury convened at the mansion itself. They walked through halls lined with European art, past stained glass windows crafted by Tiffany, beneath ceilings that had hosted senators and celebrities. They examined the scene with the clinical detachment required by law, and they delivered their verdict with the efficiency expected in cases involving powerful men. Suicide due to prolonged illness, heart disease, gout, dropsy, pain that had turned his body into a prison, no scandal, no mystery, just the cold recognition that even men who build empires eventually face battles they cannot win. Thousands came to the funeral. Senators stood beside brewers. Business titans shared pews with workers whose livelihoods depended on the Bush name. The newspapers covered it with the reverence reserved for American royalty. But underneath all the public mourning, underneath all the carefully crafted statements about legacy and contribution, there was a truth no one wanted to say too loudly. August Anheuser Busch Sr. had chosen death inside a mansion built to celebrate life, on land purchased to prove his family had arrived, in a bedroom designed to display wealth and taste and permanence. And that choice, that final act of control, was not an anomaly in the Bush family story. It was a preview. Because if you stand today at Grant's Farm, the sprawling estate where that gunshot still echoes through history, and if you look past the public attractions and the carefully maintained gardens and the Clydesdale horses that tourists come to photograph, you begin to see something the brochures do not advertise. You begin to see that this place, this monument to the American dream, has been soaked in tragedy almost as thoroughly as it has been soaked in wealth. You begin to see that the Bush family, for all their success, for all their brilliance at turning grain into gold, could never quite escape the darkness that seemed to follow their name through generations. This is not a story about beer, though beer built everything you are about to hear. This is not a story about business, though business strategy shaped every decision that mattered. This is a story about what happens when ambition succeeds so completely that it becomes a trap, when wealth grows so vast that it isolates, when a family name becomes so powerful that the people carrying it forget they are still just human, still vulnerable, still capable of breaking in ways that money cannot fix. This is the story of the Bush family and their estate, Grant's Farm, a place where triumph and tragedy have been dancing together for more than a century, where the American dream built a castle and then haunted it, where success and suffering became so entangled that you cannot pull them apart without destroying the truth of what actually happened here. And to understand how a morning could end with a gunshot in a mansion, you have to go back much farther than that bedroom, much farther than that February morning, much farther than America itself. You have to go back to the old world, to a small German village, to a family that understood something most people never learn. That opportunity does not wait for you to be ready. You either move toward it or you watch it pass. In 1839, in a village called Kastel near Mainz, Germany, a boy was born into a world that still remembered Napoleon, still lived under monarchies, still measured status by bloodlines that stretched back centuries. The village sat along the Rhine River, where trade had flowed for 1,000 years, where merchant families had learned long ago that survival meant understanding supply, demand, and the invisible networks that connected distant cities. The boy's name was Adolphus Busch, and he arrived into a family that was neither noble nor poor, neither desperate nor comfortable. They occupied that dangerous middle ground where ambition is born because comfort is too fragile to trust. Adolphus was one of 22 children, a number so large it sounds almost fictional to modern ears, but which was simply the reality of families trying to ensure that someone, anyone, would survive long enough to carry the name forward. His father, Ulrich Busch, was a successful merchant and wine dealer, a man who understood that business was not just about products but about relationships, about trust built over transactions, about reputation cultivated like a garden. Ulrich made sure his sons were educated, not with the classical training of aristocrats, but with the practical knowledge of commerce. Numbers, languages, the art of reading people, the discipline of delayed gratification. But Germany in the mid-1800s was a restless place. The revolutions of 1848 shook Europe, and though they ultimately failed, they planted ideas that would not die. Ideas about merit over birth, about opportunity over tradition, about worlds where a clever man could rise without waiting for permission from people who had never worked a day in their lives. Adolphus grew up breathing this air, and by the time he reached his late teens, he had made a decision that millions of others were making in those same years. He would leave. In 1857, at 18 years old, Adolphus Busch boarded a ship and left Germany behind. He was not fleeing persecution. He was not running from debt. He was simply doing what ambitious young men have always done when the world they are born into feels too small. He was betting on himself. The journey took weeks, crammed into steerage with hundreds of other immigrants, the air thick with sweat and hope and the particular kind of fear that comes from burning bridges you can never rebuild. When the ship finally docked in New Orleans, Adolphus stepped onto American soil carrying almost nothing. No fortune, no connections, no letters of introduction to powerful men, just a mind trained for commerce and a hunger that made poverty feel temporary. He made his way north along the Mississippi River to St. Louis, a city that in 1857 was exploding with German immigrants, a place where entire neighborhoods spoke German, where churches held services in German, where a young man with the right instincts could find work and build relationships and begin the slow climb that turns immigrants into Americans. St. Louis was also a city positioned perfectly for commerce, sitting at the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, a natural hub where goods from the interior flowed toward the coasts, where fortunes were being made by men who understood logistics and timing, and the art of being in the right place when opportunity knocked. Adolphus found work as a clerk on the riverfront, a job that sounds menial but which was actually the best education a young man could get. He watched cargo move. He watched money change hands, He watched deals get made and broken. He learned which merchants kept their word and which ones would cheat you if they thought they could get away with it. He learned that in America, unlike Europe, your name mattered less than your reputation, and your reputation was built one transaction at a time. He saved what he could, lived cheap, worked long hours, and waited for his moment. That moment came not from his own efforts alone, but from tragedy. In 1861, his father died back in Germany, and Adolphus received a small inheritance. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to stop being a clerk, enough to become an owner. He partnered with another German immigrant and started a business selling brewing supplies, hops, malt, equipment, the unglamorous backend of an industry that was growing fast because Germans drank beer the way Americans drank water, and St. Louis was full of small breweries trying to meet that demand. This was not a flashy business. Adolphus was not brewing beer himself. He was supplying the people who did, which meant he was building relationships with every brewer in the city, learning their operations, understanding their challenges, positioning himself as the man they needed. And in the process, he met a man who would change everything. Eberhard Anheuser was a German immigrant who had made money manufacturing soap, a practical, unglamorous business that had given him the capital to buy a failing brewery. The beer it produced was mediocre at best, but Eberhard was not trying to create a masterpiece. He was trying to salvage an investment, and he had something Adolphus wanted more than money. He had a daughter. Her name was Lily Anheuser, and by all accounts, she was everything a young immigrant could hope for. Beautiful. Connected to a successful family. And available. In March 1861, just as the nation was tearing itself apart over slavery and secession, Adolphus Busch married Lily Anheuser in a double ceremony where his brother married Lily's sister. It looked like romance, and maybe it was, but it was also strategy. Marriage in the 19th century was not just about love. It was about alliances, about merging families, about creating bonds that made business partnerships more reliable because blood was thicker than contracts. Almost immediately after the wedding, the Civil War erupted, and Adolphus did something that would surprise people who think of business tycoons as cowards who avoid sacrifice. He enlisted in the Union Army. He served with discipline and courage, experiencing the brutal reality of American violence, watching men die over ideas, watching the country remake itself in blood. When the war ended in 1865, Adolphus returned to St. Louis with new confidence, new focus, and a clearer understanding of what it would take to stop being an immigrant and start being a titan. He went to work for his father-in-law's brewery, and this is where the story shifts from survival to conquest. Because Adolphus Busch was not content to run a small local brewery that served a German neighborhood. He looked at the American market and saw something that other brewers missed. He saw that beer, unlike whiskey or wine, was trapped by geography. It could not travel far without spoiling. It had to be consumed close to where it was made, which meant that every brewery was a local business, limited by the distance a wagon could travel before the product turned bad. Adolphus refused to accept limits that could be engineered away. He became obsessed with solving the problem of transportation. He studied pasteurization, a technique that allowed beer to be heat-treated in a way that killed the bacteria causing spoilage without destroying flavor. Most brewers resisted it because it seemed unnatural, because it required new equipment, because it challenged the traditional craft methods they had learned in the old world. Adolphus did not care about tradition. He cared about scale. He embraced pasteurization, and suddenly his beer could survive journeys that would ruin competitors. Then he tackled the second problem, temperature. Beer needed to stay cold. So he invested in refrigerated railroad cars, using ice harvested in winter and stored in insulated compartments, creating a distribution network that could move beer across states, across regions, eventually across the entire country. It was not just clever, it was revolutionary. He was building the first truly national brewery in an era when most people still thought locally. And then came the brand that would become a crown. In 1876, Adolphus developed a new beer inspired by the light, crisp lagers being brewed in Bohemia. He named it Budweiser, borrowing the name from the Czech town of Budweis, tapping into old world associations with quality, then flipping the symbolism into something aggressively American. He marketed it not as a beer for immigrants, but as the beer for everyone. Not a beer for kings, but the king of beers. The slogan was brilliant because it was democratic and elitist at the same time. It promised quality without snobbery. It promised status without exclusion. By 1880, the company that would become Anheuser-Busch was selling beer in every state. By 1901, after Eberhard Anheuser died and Adolphus took full control, the brewery had become the largest in the United States, selling over 1 million barrels a year. Adolphus Busch was no longer a young immigrant clerk on the St. Louis riverfront. He was one of the wealthiest and most powerful businessmen in America. He lived like it too: mansions in St. Louis, in Pasadena, in New York. A villa in Germany named Villa Lilly after his wife. Travel that looked more like royal processions than business trips. Philanthropy that built museums and funded disaster relief and impressed the public with generosity that felt genuine because it was. But the thing about men like Adolphus is that wealth is never the final goal. Wealth is just the tool. What they really want is permanence. They want their name carved into history. They want something that will outlast markets and economic cycles and the inevitable mortality that waits for everyone. And that desire, that need to anchor a family name to the land itself, would eventually lead the Busch family to purchase a piece of Missouri countryside already haunted by the story of another ambitious man. A man who would become one of the most famous Americans in history, but who first learned the most brutal lessons of life not on a battlefield, not in the White House, but on a farm where the soil fought back and dreams died slow. Before the Busch name touched the land, before beer money bought the hills, before wealth transformed Missouri countryside into a private kingdom, there was a man named Ulysses S. Grant who stood on those same acres and tried to do something much simpler and much harder than building an empire. He tried to make a living from the dirt, and he failed, completely, humiliatingly, in ways that would have destroyed most men before they ever got the chance to become legends. In the 1840s, Grant was not yet a general. He was not yet a president. He was just a young army officer stationed near St. Louis, visiting a plantation called White Haven, owned by a family named Dent. The plantation sat on rolling Missouri hills, the land beautiful in the way that makes people believe in opportunity, the kind of landscape that tricks you into thinking success is just a matter of hard work. The Dent family lived well. They had money. They had slaves. They had a daughter named Julia, who moved through that world with the confidence that comes from never having to question whether the ground beneath your feet is solid. Grant fell in love with Julia Dent, and the story is often told as simple romance, two young people finding each other, destiny working its magic. But the truth is more complicated because White Haven was not just a beautiful estate. It was a functioning slave plantation. The wealth that made Julia's life comfortable came from the forced labor of human beings who had no choice in the matter. The land Grant would eventually receive as a gift was worked by people who could not leave, who built value they would never own, who made the Dent family prosperity possible through violence disguised as economics. Grant proposed to Julia under a tree on that property, and she said yes. They married, and as a wedding gift, Grant received 80 acres of land adjoining White Haven. It must have felt like a foundation, like the beginning of something stable. He was a West Point graduate, an Army officer with a future, a man married into a prominent family, now a landowner with a chance to build something permanent. This was the American dream in miniature: land, family, independence. Then the dream started rotting. Grant resigned from the Army in 1854, tired of being stationed far from his wife and children, tired of the low pay and the boredom of peacetime military life. He decided to become a farmer, not because he loved farming, but because it was what men were supposed to do: provide, build, create value from the earth. He moved onto his 80 acres and began clearing land, pulling stumps, plowing fields, planting crops. He built a cabin with his own hands, cutting timber and fitting logs, and he named it Hardscrabble. The name was supposed to be a joke, a little self-deprecating humor about the difficulty of starting from scratch. It turned out to be a prophecy. Everything went wrong. The Missouri soil was stubborn. The weather was cruel. Crops failed. Prices collapsed. Grant worked himself into exhaustion, but the land gave back nothing. He tried wheat. He tried potatoes. He tried everything the advice manuals said would work. Nothing worked. By 1857, he was struggling so badly that he was hauling firewood into St. Louis and selling it on street corners just to buy food for his family. Can you picture that? A West Point graduate, a future president, standing in the cold, selling wood to strangers, watching people who knew his name walk past without buying because they knew he was desperate, and desperate men have no leverage. In 1858, Grant's father-in-law let him farm some of the White Haven land, hoping more acreage would help. It did not help. The debt kept growing, the failures kept piling up. By 1859, Grant could not even afford to buy his family Christmas presents. He pawned his watch. He borrowed money he could not repay. He moved back toward White Haven, not as a successful son-in-law, but as a man broken by the very dream he had been promised would save him. Hardscrabble stood empty, a monument to failure, a cabin built by hand that became a symbol of everything Grant could not make work. Then the Civil War started, and Grant got pulled back into the Army, not because he wanted glory, but because he needed a paycheck. And in the chaos of war, something strange happened. The man who could not grow wheat became one of the most effective military commanders in American history. The man who failed at every civilian job he tried turned into Ulysses S. Grant, the general who broke the Confederacy, the man Lincoln trusted when he trusted almost no one, the hammer that ended the rebellion and reshaped the nation. After the war, Grant became president. Twice. He stood at the pinnacle of American power, his name carved into history, his face destined for currency, his legacy secured in ways that very few humans ever achieve. But Hardscrabble remained standing. A cabin in the Missouri woods, a reminder that before he was a legend, he was a man who could not make dirt produce, a man who stood on land that refused to cooperate, a man who learned that success and failure are not opposites, they are neighbors, and sometimes they live in the same life just a few years apart. And here is where the story twists into something almost mythological. After Grant's presidency, he got tangled in a Wall Street investment scheme. He trusted the wrong people. He lost everything. The man who had commanded armies, who had occupied the White House, who had been celebrated as a national hero, ended up bankrupt. And in his desperation to pay debts and provide for his family, he signed away his beloved Missouri property. The land where he had proposed to Julia, the land where Hardscrabble stood, the land where he had failed and then left and then risen and then fallen again. It slipped out of his hands, sold to pay creditors who did not care about sentiment. Grant died in 1885, broke and broken, just days after finishing his memoirs in a race against throat cancer, writing furiously to leave his family something, anything, after he was gone. The memoirs became a bestseller and saved his widow from poverty. But the land was gone. White Haven and the acres around it passed into other hands, their value determined by markets that did not care about the man who had struggled there. And then, in 1903, the southern portion of that land was purchased by the Bush family, not as a historical preservation, not as a patriotic gesture, but as a private estate for the heir to the brewing empire. August Anheuser Busch Sr., the son of Adolphus, the man being groomed to lead the company into the 20th century, bought the land because it was beautiful, because it was large enough to build something grand, because it sat just outside St. Louis in a way that felt both private and connected. The fact that Ulysses S. Grant had once struggled there, had failed there, had built Hardscrabble there was a footnote. Interesting, maybe. Romantic, certainly. But not the point. The point was that the Bush family had reached a level of wealth where they could buy land that had defeated a future president, where they could build a mansion that would dwarf anything Grant ever lived in, where they could create a private kingdom that would make Hardscrabble look like exactly what it was, a cabin built by a desperate man who did not know he would one day become a legend. The collision of these two American stories, Grant's failure and Bush's triumph, did not cancel each other out. They stacked on top of each other like sediment, creating a place where the mythology of success and the reality of suffering existed in the same dirt. And August Anheuser Busch Sr. stood on that land and decided to build something that would prove his family had arrived. Not just in America, not just in business, but in history. He wanted a mansion that would look like it had been transported from Europe. He wanted a palace that would announce to anyone who saw it that the Bush family was no longer a story about immigrants making good. They were a dynasty. They were American royalty, and this land, haunted by Grant's ghost, would be their throne. Construction began in 1910, and from the start it was clear that August Anheuser Busch Sr. was not building a house. He was building a statement, a declaration carved into brick and stone and stained glass. A monument designed to outlast markets and depressions, and the inevitable forgetting that erases most men within a generation of their death. He hired architects who understood European grandeur, but who also knew how to adapt it for American tastes, for American scale, for the particular kind of ambition that demanded beauty but also strength. The style they chose was French Renaissance revival, inspired by the chateaux of the Loire Valley, those palaces built by French kings and nobles during the 16th century when wealth meant showing everyone exactly how wealthy you were. But the Grants' farm mansion was not a delicate copy. It was heavier, more muscular, built with red brick instead of pale stone, with fewer ornamental flourishes and more structural weight, a face that projected power without looking frivolous, elegance without looking weak. It was the kind of building that said, "We are cultured, but we are also serious. We appreciate beauty, but we are not soft." The mansion rose over 3 stories, built above a full basement, sprawling across enough square footage to house a small hotel. More than 24 rooms, 14 bathrooms, an almost absurd number for the era, a luxury that went beyond necessity into the realm of display. Spaces designed not for private family life, but for hosting, for entertaining, for impressing guests who arrived already expecting to be impressed and still left talking about what they had seen. Inside, every detail was chosen like a piece in a collection. Tiffany-stained glass windows depicting hunting scenes, because the Bush family wanted to be associated with aristocratic pursuits, with the kind of leisure that required vast private land and the time to roam it. A gun room displaying trophies from hunts around the world, heads mounted on walls, skins stretched across floors, proof that the family did not just own land. They dominated it, they took from it. They conquered it the way their German ancestors had once conquered the challenges of immigration and poverty. The floors shifted between oak and walnut and marble, each choice deliberate, each material selected not just for beauty, but for the message it sent. Marble in the public spaces where visitors entered, because marble has been the language of power since Rome. Wood in the private areas, because wood is warm, is livable, is the material of homes, not museums. Art throughout the house, paintings celebrating the American West, because even as the family built a European castle, they still needed America to see them as part of the frontier myth, as conquerors of land and opportunity, as heirs to the pioneers even though they had arrived long after the hardest battles were won. The cost was staggering for its era. Exact figures are hard to confirm because families like the Bushes did not advertise their spending the way modern celebrities do. But estimates suggest the construction approached amounts that would translate into tens of millions in today's dollars. It was completed in 1913, and when August Sr. and his wife Alice moved in, it must have felt like victory. Like the culmination of everything Adolphus Bush had dreamed when he stepped off that ship in New Orleans more than 50 years earlier. The immigrant's grandson now lived in a palace. The family that had sold brewing supplies now owned an estate that rivaled anything in Europe. The name Bush was no longer just associated with beer. It was associated with permanence. But the same year the mansion was completed, the family patriarch died. Adolphus Bush passed away in Germany. His body returned to St. Louis for a funeral that drew immense crowds, thousands lining the streets to watch the procession, newspapers covering it like the death of a king. It was not just grief. It was public recognition that this immigrant had become part of the American aristocracy, that his story was now part of the nation's story, that his name would not be forgotten. August Sr. inherited leadership of Anheuser-Busch at a moment when being German in America was about to become dangerous. World War I was looming, and once it started, the same heritage that had been a selling point, the German tradition, the old world quality, the connection to European brewing excellence, became a liability. Anti-German sentiment swept the country. German-language newspapers were shut down. German Americans were accused of disloyalty. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. Dachshunds were kicked in the streets. The Bush family, no matter how American they had become, no matter how many jobs they provided, no matter how much beer they sold, could not escape the suspicion that came with their last name. And then came an even larger threat, one that did not care about nationality or heritage or how many workers depended on you. One that was rooted in American morality, in political power, in the belief that alcohol was the root of society's problems, and that banning it would create a better, cleaner, more virtuous nation. Prohibition. The movement had been building for decades, driven by women who had watched alcohol destroy their families, by religious groups who saw drinking as sin, by progressive reformers who believed that eliminating vice would eliminate poverty and crime. And in 1919, they won. The 18th Amendment was ratified, and on January 17, 1920, it became illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport alcoholic beverages in the United States. The brewing industry, an industry that employed hundreds of thousands of people, that represented billions of dollars in value, that had become part of American culture, was supposed to die. Instantly. By law. For most breweries, that is exactly what happened. Companies that had existed for generations shut their doors forever. Workers lost their jobs. Families lost their livelihoods. Entire neighborhoods built around brewing communities collapsed. The industry was supposed to be dead. But August Anheuser Busch Sr. refused to let his family's empire become a casualty of moral legislation. He forced Anheuser-Busch to evolve, to transform into something unrecognizable, to survive by becoming something other than a brewery. They produced near beer, a legal beverage with less than 0.5% alcohol that tasted like disappointment but kept some of the production lines running. They made malt syrup, technically legal, which home brewers could use to make their own beer in private, winking at the law without quite breaking it. They manufactured bakers' yeast, ice cream, corn products, refrigeration equipment, anything that could use brewery infrastructure and keep workers employed. It was not glamorous. It was not the dream, but it was survival. And August Sr. held the company together through 13 long years of legal drought, watching competitors collapse, watching organized crime take over the alcohol market, watching speakeasies flourish while legitimate businesses withered. He waited. The company waited. The workers waited. All of them betting that America would eventually realize that prohibition was not creating virtue. It was creating violence, corruption, and a massive black market that enriched criminals while impoverishing honest businesses. In December 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing prohibition. The nightmare was over. Beer was legal again. Anheuser-Busch had survived. The first legal cases rolled off the production line, and it should have been August Sr.'s greatest triumph. The moment when the man who steered the empire through the storm finally got to enjoy the calm. But by then, his body was failing, heart disease, gout, dropsy that made his legs swell until walking became agony, pain that turned every hour into a negotiation. He had won the battle but lost his health in the process, and the mansion that was supposed to be a celebration of success had become something else. It had become a stage where private suffering played out behind walls built to impress the public. It had become a place where failure and triumph existed in the same rooms, where the descendants of immigrants lived like kings while their bodies betrayed them, where wealth could buy everything except the one thing that mattered most when you were dying: peace. On that February morning in 1934, August Anheuser-Busch Sr. looked at the empire he had preserved, at the mansion he lived in, at the legacy he had protected, and decided he could not endure another day of pain. He chose control in the only place he could still claim it, and the gunshot that ended his life also marked the end of an era. The immigrant generation was gone. The men who had built the empire from scratch, who remembered poverty, who carried the hunger that made success feel urgent, they were dead. What came next would be different, louder, more glamorous, more reckless, and in some ways more tragic, because the mansion still stood. The estate still sprawled across hundreds of acres. The Busch name still meant power. But the men who would carry that name into the future, the heirs who inherited wealth they did not build, would have to navigate a world where privilege and expectation created pressures their grandfathers never faced. And some of them would rise to the challenge. And some of them would break under the weight. And the mansion would witness all of it, absorbing the stories the way old buildings do, becoming not just a home, but a repository of everything the family could not escape. August Anheuser-Busch Jr., known to everyone as Gussie, was born in 1899, which meant he grew up inside the empire but before it became untouchable. He remembered when being German was still a source of pride, before the wars made it complicated. He remembered prohibition not as ancient history, but as the backdrop of his young adulthood, the years when the family business was illegal, when survival required reinvention, when the name Busch carried both weight and vulnerability. And unlike his father, who was methodical and careful, who treated the business like a sacred trust that required discipline, Gussie treated life like a performance. He was bold where August Sr. was cautious. He was flamboyant where his father was reserved. He loved attention, loved action, loved the idea that if you were going to be rich, you might as well enjoy it loudly. During Prohibition, while the older generation managed the grim work of keeping the company alive, Gussie learned sales. He learned charm. He learned how to turn a transaction into a relationship into loyalty, loyalty into market dominance. He understood something that pure businessmen sometimes miss, that people do not just buy products, they buy stories. They buy associations. They buy the feeling that comes with the brand. And when Prohibition ended, Gussie helped deliver one of the most brilliant marketing moments in American business history. In April 1933, just after repeal, Anheuser-Busch sent a wagon pulled by 8 Clydesdale horses to the White House, delivering beer to President Franklin Roosevelt as a gift, a symbol that America was stepping out of the darkness of Prohibition into something familiar and celebratory. The Clydesdales were not just horses. They were living symbols of strength, tradition, and old-world quality. They were marketing genius disguised as pageantry. And Gussie understood immediately that those horses were more valuable than any advertisement because they made people feel something. They made Budweiser seem not just like beer, but like an American tradition returned from exile. But Gussie did not become president of the company immediately. That role went to his older brother, Adolphus Busch III, who took over after their father's suicide. Gussie waited. He worked. He built influence. He served in World War II, not in combat but in logistics, stationed at the Pentagon, helping manage supply chains, earning commendations, proving he could operate inside structure even if his personality screamed against it. When the war ended, he returned to St. Louis with new confidence, new connections, and the patience of a man who knew his time was coming. In 1946, his brother Adolphus died suddenly of a heart attack, and Gussie finally took the throne. He became president of Anheuser-Busch at 47 years old, and almost immediately everything changed. Because Gussie did not just run the company, he performed it. He turned Anheuser-Busch into a kingdom with himself as the flamboyant king. He traveled constantly, visiting distributors, hosting events, showing up at bars and restaurants and grocery stores, making sure everyone knew that the man at the top was not some distant executive locked in an office. He was a presence. A personality, a walking embodiment of the brand. Under Gussie's leadership, Anheuser-Busch exploded in scale. Budweiser went from the largest American beer to a global phenomenon. New breweries were built. Distribution expanded into every corner of the country. Marketing became more aggressive, more creative, more willing to take risks. And Gussie himself became a celebrity, not just in St. Louis, but nationally. He was the kind of businessman people recognized on the street, the kind of name that appeared in gossip columns as often as business pages. But the mansion at Grant's Farm, the place where his father had died, remained quiet for a while, too quiet. The memories were too heavy, the silence too thick. Gussie did not live in the big house immediately. He stayed in other properties, keeping distance from the room where the gunshot had echoed, from the space where death had claimed the man he respected but could never quite become. It would take a new person to reopen those rooms, to fill them with life again, to transform the mansion from a memorial into a celebration. And that person arrived not in St. Louis, but across an ocean. In 1949, Gussie traveled to Switzerland on business, and one evening he walked into a family restaurant in Lucerne. The place was warm, elegant, the kind of establishment where service was an art form passed down through generations. Behind the polite atmosphere, serving guests with a smile that made the room feel softer, was a young hostess named Gertrude. Her friends called her Trudy. She was 22 years old, blonde, radiant, carrying herself with the kind of grace that comes from people who have worked in hospitality long enough to make strangers feel like the most important person in the room. Gussie was captivated. Instantly. Completely. In the way that powerful men fall for beautiful women, with the confidence that comes from knowing they can offer a life most people only see in magazines. He stayed at the restaurant far longer than necessary. He ran up a large tab not to show off, but to buy time to keep the conversation going to make sure she noticed him. Before the evening ended, he asked her out. Before the date ended, he proposed. It was impulsive in a way that looks romantic in movies but reckless in real life. There was just one problem. Gussie was still married, though separated, living in the wreckage of a first marriage that had not survived his ambitions and his appetites. But Gussie was patient when patience served his desires. He courted Trudy across an ocean, sending letters, gifts, promises. He offered her not just wealth, but a role, lady of an American dynasty. The woman who would revive Grant's farm, the hostess who would turn a mansion into a palace of celebration. In 1952, after his divorce was finalized, Gussie married Trudy. She was 25, he was 53. The age gap did not matter to him. What mattered was that she brought energy, light, a willingness to embrace the extravagance that defined his vision of life. And Trudy did something that no one else had been able to do since August Sr.'s death. She insisted the big house be reopened. The locked rooms were cleaned, aired out, restored. Furniture that had been covered with sheets was unveiled. Windows that had been kept dark were thrown open. The mansion that had felt like a tomb began to feel like a home again. Trudy decorated with a mix of European elegance and American practicality, creating spaces that felt grand but livable, impressive but warm. And she convinced Gussie to embrace the estate not as a retreat, not as a private hideaway, but as a stage. Grant's farm under Trudy entered its most glamorous era. Parties returned. Not small family gatherings, but events that drew hundreds of people, celebrations rooted in German tradition, Oktoberfest festivals with folk music and dancing, harvest feasts where employees were treated like guests, champagne flowing like water, food served on tables that seemed to stretch forever. The estate became a place where power came to pay respect. Presidents visited, senators, business titans, celebrities. Anyone who mattered in America or wanted to matter eventually found themselves walking through the gates of Grant's farm, marveling at the Clydesdales, touring the grounds, sitting in the big house where Trudy presided like a queen who had learned her role perfectly. But Gussie was not content to keep his kingdom private. He had the instincts of a showman and the ego of a builder. In 1953, he made a decision that linked the Busch name to St. Louis in a way that went beyond beer. He bought the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team, saving them from potential relocation, turning himself into not just a brewing magnate but a sports owner, a man whose decisions affected the emotional life of an entire city. Owning the Cardinals was business, yes, but it was also identity. It meant owning a piece of the city's soul. It gave him a platform to turn beer marketing into culture, to make Budweiser inseparable from baseball, from summer, from American leisure. And then he did something that still shapes the estate today. In 1954, Gussie opened portions of Grant's farm to the public for free. The idea came from someone who understood what most wealthy families refused to admit. People wanted to see the world behind the gates. They wanted a glimpse of how dynasties lived. They wanted to touch, even briefly, the fantasy of wealth and power and land and animals and beauty concentrated in one place. Gussie listened, and soon thousands of visitors were streaming through the estate every year, riding trams, feeding animals, marveling at the Clydesdales housed in stables that looked like cathedrals, wandering through a Bavarian-style courtyard called the Bauernhof that made visitors feel like they had been transported to rural Germany. Exotic animals roamed the property. Buffalo beside zebras, camels and kangaroos and deer parks where children could feed creatures they had only seen in books. The landscape blurred Missouri farmland with something closer to a global menagerie, a Noah's Ark built by beer money. People fell in love with it. Grant's farm was no longer just a mansion on a hill. It was an experience, a gift, a public stage for a private dynasty, and for a while it looked like Gussie had solved the oldest problem in American wealth: how to be powerful without being hated, how to be rich without being isolated. He opened the gates and invited the public to taste the fantasy. And in return, the public forgave a lot. But forgiveness has limits, and the shadows that had haunted the estate since August Sr.'s death were not gone. They were just waiting, waiting for the next tragedy, waiting for the next moment when wealth would prove useless against the things that actually matter, waiting to remind everyone that no amount of Clydesdales or champagne or public goodwill can protect a family from the darkness that lives inside its own walls. For a long time, it looked like Gussie had won. Not just in business, where Anheuser-Busch kept growing, kept dominating, kept turning beer into an empire that touched every corner of American life, but in life itself. He had wealth. He had Trudy. He had the Cardinals. He had Grant's farm transformed into a public treasure. He had children, a dynasty being built across generations. He had everything the American dream promised, and he seemed to enjoy it without apology, without guilt, without the restraint that so many wealthy families hide behind. But life does not care how much you have. It does not respect your balance sheet. It does not grant immunity because you own horses and mansions and baseball teams. And in 1974, tragedy arrived at Grant's farm in the cruelest form possible. The kind that does not care about power or preparation. The kind that simply takes. Gussie's youngest daughter, Christina, was 8 years old. Born late in his life when he was already an older man, she had become the center of his world in a way that surprised people who thought of him as too tough, too commanding, too focused on business to soften. But he softened for her. She was the child who reminded him that life was not just about building and winning and dominating. She was innocence, joy. The part of his legacy that had nothing to do with beer or money or power. In 1974, Christina died in a car accident. Sudden, brutal, the kind of loss that splits a person in half. One moment she existed, full of life, carrying the future in her smile. The next moment she was gone, and no amount of wealth or influence or connections could bring her back. Gussie, the man who had always seemed too large to break, who had bulldozed through every obstacle, who had turned challenges into opportunities, crumbled. He sank into depression, deep and black and suffocating. He started drinking harder, not the social drinking of celebrations, but the kind that tries to drown memory. His behavior became erratic, angry outbursts, long silences, days where he could not bring himself to show up for the performance he had always been so good at. People around him began to worry, not just because they cared about him, though some did, but because they cared about the company. Anheuser-Busch was still the family business, but it was also a public company with shareholders, with expectations, with a board that had responsibilities beyond loyalty to a grieving father. And the board started asking questions. Is he fit to lead? Is his grief affecting decisions? Is the company at risk? Then Trudy, the woman who had revived the mansion, who had brought light back to Grant's farm, asked for divorce. The marriage that had looked so perfect, the partnership that had defined the glamorous era of the estate, could not survive the storm that grief had created. In 1978, after more than 2 decades together, Trudy left, and Gussie was alone in the mansion again, surrounded by rooms that had once rang with celebration but now felt like monuments to everything he had lost. And then came the betrayal, or what Gussie saw as betrayal. In 1975, the board of directors, alarmed by his behavior, moved to remove him from leadership. A corporate coup dressed up in the language of responsibility and governance. The person positioned to benefit was his son, August Anheuser-Busch III, a man who had been groomed for leadership, who understood the business, who the board believed could guide the company into the future without the volatility that grief had brought to Gussie's reign. For Gussie, it was not just a loss of position. It was a rejection. A statement that he, the man who had turned Anheuser-Busch into the largest brewery in the world, who had saved the Cardinals, who had opened Grant's farm to the public, was no longer needed. That his grief made him a liability. That his son, his own blood, was taking what was his. The king pushed aside by his heir, the dynasty continuing but without him. Gussie retreated to Grant's farm like an exiled monarch. He wandered the estate that had once been his theater, now surrounded by ghosts. The ghost of his daughter. The ghost of his father, who had also ended his life in that house. The ghost of the man he used to be, before tragedy taught him that control is an illusion and grief is a battle no one wins. He married again, quickly, to his secretary Margaret, a quiet woman who had worked alongside him for years. She became the first woman appointed to the Anheuser-Busch board, a gesture that looked progressive but was really just Gussie trying to rebuild anything that felt like partnership. But Margaret died suddenly, leaving him alone again. And the mansion, which had been filled with so much life under Trudy, which had hosted so many celebrations, so many moments of triumph, became quiet again. Not peaceful, just quiet. The way places get when too much has happened inside them. Gussie lived another 13 years after being forced out of the company. He remained wealthy. He remained famous in St. Louis, but he was no longer the showman, no longer the king. He was an old man haunted by losses he could not fix, living in a mansion that had witnessed too many endings. In 1989, at 90 years old, Gussie died at Grant's farm, not by his own hand the way his father had, but peacefully, if a life soaked in grief can ever be called peaceful. His will revealed the complexity that had always existed beneath the public persona. He left symbolic items to people who had mattered. He left instructions about art and possessions. And he left his eldest son, August Anheuser Busch III, the man who had taken his company, almost nothing. Just a single golden telegram that had been passed down through generations. Even in death, Gussie sent a message. You took my throne, but you never got my blessing. After Gussie died, the big house became less of a home and more of a symbol. It was used for gatherings, for events, for weddings where strangers exchanged vows in rooms that had absorbed so much family tragedy. The private became public in the way that happens when families run out of heirs willing to carry the weight of history. Grant's farm continued as an attraction. The Clydesdales still drew crowds. Children still fed goats. Tourists still took photos. But the mansion itself, the heart of the estate, became a stage that anyone with money could rent, a backdrop for celebrations that had nothing to do with the Busch family except that their money built the space. And the shadows that had always lived there, the darkness that had taken August Sr. and broken Gussie, did not disappear just because the family stopped living in the big house full-time, because the story was not over. The tragedy was not finished. The pattern that seemed to follow the Busch name, the way death and scandal kept circling back, was about to enter its most modern, most public, most disturbing phase. And this time, it would not be an old man ending his suffering. It would be young people dying in ways that looked like accidents but felt like something darker. Like the price you pay when privilege becomes a shield that protects you from consequences until it does not. August Anheuser Busch IV was born in 1964, which meant he grew up in the aftermath of glamour, in the shadow of men who had built empires and broken under the weight of them. He was Gussie's grandson, the heir to a dynasty that now spanned more than a century, a young man who carried a name that opened every door in St. Louis and many beyond. He had the looks people associate with heirs: tall, confident, the kind of face that photographs well. The kind of presence that makes people assume competence before he opens his mouth. But he also carried something else, a recklessness, a belief maybe never spoken aloud but visible in his choices that consequences were for other people. He was raised with wealth that most humans cannot imagine: private schools, international travel, access to any experience money could buy. He learned to fly helicopters. He drove fast cars. He moved through the world with the ease of someone who had never been told no in a way that mattered. And as he grew older, as he began working his way up through Anheuser Busch, it became clear that he was being groomed to lead. Not just because of his last name, though that mattered, but because he had charm. He understood marketing. He knew how to talk to distributors, how to sell the brand, how to make people believe that Budweiser was not just beer but American identity bottled and sold. But in 1983, when August IV was only 19 years old, something happened that should have changed everything. That should have been a moment when privilege met consequence, when the family name collided with justice, when the pattern of tragedy consuming the Busch family became impossible to ignore. But it did not change anything, not in the way it should have, and that might be the darkest part of the story. On the night of December 19, 1983, August IV was in Tucson, Arizona, attending the University of Arizona. He left a bar with a young woman named Michelle Frederick. She was 22 years old, a waitress, someone whose life did not have the protections that August's did, someone who was probably excited to be in a Corvette with a Busch, probably thought it was the beginning of a story she would tell for years. They were both drinking. August was driving. The road was dark. And at a curve known for accidents, a curve that had warning signs, a curve that required attention and caution, August lost control. The car flipped. Michelle was thrown from the vehicle, and she died, instantly, her body found in the wreckage of a night that started with possibility and ended with her life erased. August did not stay at the scene. He did not call for help. He did not try to save her or report the accident. He left. He went home. And when police found him hours later, injured and disoriented, he claimed amnesia. He said he could not remember what happened, could not remember the crash, could not remember Michelle, could not remember anything that would make him responsible. Investigators found signs of alcohol, empty beer cans in the car, evidence that suggested speed and recklessness and a level of intoxication that should have made the case straightforward. A young man drunk, driving too fast, killing someone, fleeing the scene. The kind of case that for most people ends with prison. But the Busch family hired lawyers, expensive lawyers. The kind who understand that evidence has to be collected properly, that procedures have to be followed exactly, that time is a weapon if you know how to use it. The case dragged on. Toxicology results became contested. The time between the accident and the blood tests meant alcohol levels were unclear. Witnesses were questioned. Timelines were debated. And in the end, after legal maneuvering that cost more money than most people earn in a lifetime, authorities declined to file charges. Insufficient evidence, they said. Not enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that August was driving drunk, that he was at fault, that he should face consequences. Michelle Frederick was buried. Her family grieved. And August Anheuser Busch IV continued his life. 2 years later, in 1985, he was involved in another incident. A chase with undercover police officers. A confrontation that ended with charges that were eventually dropped or reduced. The details are murky because families like the Bushes are very good at keeping details murky. But the pattern was clear. August lived in a world where mistakes did not follow him, where the rules that governed everyone else bent around his last name. And despite everything, he kept rising through the company. He worked in marketing, shaping campaigns, learning the business from the inside, proving that he was more than just a name. In 2006, he became CEO of Anheuser-Busch, the last Busch to lead the company their great-great-grandfather had built. And for a while, it looked like the story had a redemptive arc. Like the troubled young man had become a competent leader, like the family tragedy was in the past. But then in 2008, the ultimate defeat arrived. Not in a car crash. Not in a courtroom, in a boardroom. InBev, a Belgian-Brazilian brewing giant, moved to acquire Anheuser-Busch in a hostile takeover. August IV fought it. He argued that the company should remain independent, that the Busch family legacy demanded control, that selling would betray everything his ancestors had built. But the board, including his own father, August Anheuser-Busch III, disagreed. They accepted the offer. They took the money. And with signatures on contracts, more than 150 years of family ownership ended. The empire that began with an immigrant stepping off a boat in New Orleans passed into foreign hands. August IV remained wealthy. He received a massive payout, but the crown was gone. The family business that had defined the Busch name for 6 generations no longer belonged to them. And August, the man who was supposed to carry the legacy forward, became just another rich person with a famous last name. No kingdom, no throne, just money. And then in 2010, another death touched his life. His girlfriend, Adrienne Martin, was found dead in his bed at his home. She was 27 years old. The medical examiner found lethal levels of oxycodone and cocaine in her system. The death was ruled accidental, an overdose, not suspicious, not criminal, just tragic. But questions followed the way they always do when someone dies in proximity to power. Was August involved? Did he provide the drugs? Could he have saved her? Should he be held responsible? Lawsuits were filed by her family. Settlements were reached. No criminal charges were filed. And once again, August Anheuser-Busch IV walked away from a death that happened in his orbit, surrounded by lawyers and silence and the particular kind of protection that wealth provides. Adrienne Martin was buried. Her family grieved. And August continued his life, quieter now, more private, but still untouched by the consequences that would have destroyed someone without his last name. And through all of it, Grant's farm remained standing. The mansion still sat on the Missouri hills. The Clydesdales still paraded. Tourists still came by the thousands. Children still fed animals. Couples still got married in the big house, exchanging vows in rooms where death had echoed multiple times, where gunshots and grief and scandal had soaked into the walls. The past and present coexisted, separated only by the human ability to forget what a building remembers. If you visit Grant's farm today, you will see beauty. You will see carefully maintained grounds, European architecture transported to the American Midwest, animals that make children laugh, Clydesdales that make adults feel like they have touched something iconic. You will see families taking photos, couples holding hands, tourists marveling at the strange collision of German tradition and Missouri landscape. You will see what the Busch family wanted you to see. The success story. The American dream realized. The dynasty that turned beer into culture. But if you know the stories, if you understand what happened inside the big house, inside the family, inside the pattern of tragedy that seems to follow the Busch name through generations, you start to see something else. You start to see that Grant's farm is not just a monument to success. It is a monument to the cost of success, to the way wealth isolates, to the way power creates its own kind of prison, to the way privilege can become a curse disguised as a blessing. The land itself carries layers of American mythology that do not fit together neatly. This was where Ulysses S. Grant, a future president, failed as a farmer, stood in the cold selling firewood, learned that hard work does not always lead to success. This was where an immigrant family bought their way into history, building a palace on land that had defeated a war hero, proving that in America, money can buy you a place in the story even if you arrive late. Hardscrabble still stands. The cabin Grant built with his own hands, the structure that was supposed to be his foundation, that became instead a symbol of his failure, is preserved on the estate like a relic. Tourists can visit it, can walk through the small rooms, can imagine what it must have felt like to be a West Point graduate reduced to selling wood. And then they can turn around and see the Bush Mansion rising in the distance, enormous and elegant, a building that cost more than Grant earned in his entire life. The contrast is intentional. The Bush family kept Hardscrabble because it makes their story look more impressive. Look how far we came. Look what we built. Look at the difference between failure and triumph. But the truth is more complicated, because Grant's failure did not stop him from becoming one of the most important Americans in history. His time on that land, his suffering, his humiliation, taught him something about resilience that money cannot teach. And the Bush family's success, for all its grandeur, did not protect them from suffering. August Sr.'s suicide, Gussie's grief, Christina's death, Michelle Frederick's death, Adrian Martin's death, the corporate takeover that ended family control, the scandals that followed the heirs, the darkness that kept circling back no matter how much wealth they accumulated. The mansion has witnessed all of it: birth and death, celebration and suicide, triumph and collapse. It has heard champagne corks pop and gunshots fire. It has hosted presidents and hidden bodies. It has been a home and a museum and a wedding venue. It has been open to the public and closed to protect privacy. It has been everything a building can be except simple. And that is what makes Grant's Farm such a strange, haunting place. Because it refuses to be just one story. It is not just a success story, though it is that. It is not just a tragedy, though it is that too. It is a collision of American myths. The immigrant dream, the presidential failure, the brewing empire, the family curse, the public gift, the private suffering, all of it stacked on top of each other like sediment, creating a place where the past never quite lets go. In 2017, members of the Bush family took steps to secure the farm's future, ensuring it would continue operating as a public attraction, preserving it as a place where people can still touch a piece of American history. The Clydesdales still live in their cathedral-like stables. The Bauernhof still transports visitors to a Bavarian village that never existed outside imagination. The animals still roam their habitats, and the big house still stands private now, rented out for events, a backdrop for other people's celebrations, a stage that no longer belongs to the family that built it. The visitors who come do not usually know the full story. They do not know about August Sr.'s suicide. They do not know about Gussie's grief. They do not know about the deaths that followed August IV. They do not know that the land they are walking on once defeated a president. They just know that Grant's Farm is beautiful, that it feels like stepping into a different world, that it gives them a glimpse of wealth and history and tradition that most people never get to see. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the public does not need to know every dark corner of the story. Maybe the gift of opening the gates, of sharing the beauty of letting strangers walk through a private kingdom, is its own kind of redemption. Maybe the Bush family, for all their flaws, for all the tragedy that followed them, gave something valuable to St. Louis and to the thousands of people who visit every year. But the mansion knows. Buildings do not forget. They absorb the lives lived inside them. They carry the echoes of voices long silent. They remember the moments when everything changed. And if you stand in the big house, in the rooms where August Sr. died, where Gussie grieved, where the family that built an empire slowly lost control of it, you can feel the weight of all those stories pressing down. Not in a supernatural way, in a human way, in the way that places remind us that success and suffering are not opposites. They are companions, and sometimes they live in the same house. There is a pattern in the Bush family story that is impossible to ignore once you see it. A rhythm of triumph followed by tragedy, of success that carries a shadow, of wealth that cannot protect the people it surrounds. It is tempting to call it a curse, to frame it in supernatural terms, to suggest that something dark attached itself to the family when they bought land that had defeated a president, when they built a palace on ground soaked in failure. But curses are not real. What is real is simpler and more brutal. Wealth creates its own problems. Privilege builds its own prisons. And families that rise too high too fast often discover that the view from the top includes a long way down. The pattern starts with Adolphus Busch, the immigrant who built the empire. His story is pure American myth. Arrive with nothing, work hard, take risks, build something permanent, die wealthy and respected. It is the story America tells itself when it wants to believe that opportunity is real, that merit matters, that anyone can rise if they just try hard enough. And Adolphus did all of that. He succeeded so completely that his name became synonymous with American beer, with celebration, with the idea that brewing was not just business but culture. But his son, August Sr., inherited the empire during the one era that should have killed it, Prohibition. He kept the company alive through pure will and strategy, but the stress broke his body. Heart disease, gout, pain that made life unbearable. And when the victory finally came, when beer was legal again, when the empire was saved, August Sr. could not enjoy it. His body had already surrendered, so he took control in the only way he had left. He chose death, inside the mansion built to celebrate success, surrounded by wealth that could not save him. Then came Gussie, the showman, the man who seemed immune to suffering because he refused to take anything too seriously. He turned Anheuser-Busch into the largest brewery in the world. He bought the Cardinals. He opened Grant's Farm to the public. He married beautiful women. He lived loudly and without apology, and then his youngest daughter died, 8 years old, gone in an instant. And Gussie, the man who had always been too big to break, shattered. He drank himself into depression. His marriage collapsed. His company pushed him out. And he spent the last 13 years of his life as an exile in his own kingdom, haunted by losses he could not fix. Then came August III, who took the company from his father and ran it with competence and discipline, but without the charisma that had defined earlier generations. He was the corporate leader, the manager, the man who understood that Anheuser-Busch was no longer just a family business, but a public company with responsibilities beyond legacy. And under his watch, the family lost control. The empire that had survived Prohibition, that had grown into a global brand that had been passed down through 5 generations, was sold to InBev. The Busch family became spectators to their own history. And then came August IV, the heir who was supposed to carry the name into the future. He had charm and intelligence and ambition. He also had recklessness. He was involved in deaths that would have sent most people to prison, but which he walked away from, shielded by lawyers and money and the particular kind of justice that bends around powerful families. He became CEO and then lost the company. He lived through another death in his home and faced no consequences. He remains wealthy, but the dynasty is over. The pattern is clear. Each generation faced a crisis. Each generation lost something irreplaceable. Success did not protect them. Wealth did not save them. The name that opened every door also carried weight that crushed some of the people who bore it. And the mansion at Grant's Farm witnessed all of it, absorbing the stories, becoming less a home and more a monument to the idea that the American dream, when stretched across generations, often becomes a nightmare. But here is what makes the pattern even more tragic. The Busch family also gave a lot. They employed thousands of people. They built infrastructure that supported entire communities. They donated to charities, funded hospitals, supported the arts. Gussie opened Grant's Farm to the public for free, giving people access to beauty and history they could never afford on their own. The family created culture not just through beer, but through the Clydesdales, through the Cardinals, through the estate that became a St. Louis landmark. So the story is not simple. It is not just about wealth destroying people, though it did that. It is not just about privilege shielding people from consequences, though it did that too. It is about the complexity of legacy, about the way success and suffering coexist, about the way a family can be both generous and reckless, both admirable and tragic, both beloved and cursed by the same choices that define them. And Grant's Farm stands at the center of it all, a place where all those contradictions meet, where presidential failure and immigrant success occupy the same dirt, where public celebration and private suffering share the same walls, where the American dream built a castle and then discovered that castles do not protect you from the things that actually matter. Love, health, peace, the ability to live without being haunted by what you have done or what has been done to you. If you visit Grant's Farm today, you can feel all of this if you pay attention, not in a mystical way, but in the way that places carry history. The Clydesdales are still magnificent. The grounds are still beautiful. The Bauernhof still feels like a transported village. Children still laugh. Families still take photos. Couples still get married in the big house, starting their lives together in rooms where other lives ended badly. And maybe that is the final truth about Grant's farm, that life continues, that beauty persists, that even in places soaked in tragedy, people still find reasons to celebrate. The Bush family built something that outlasted their control of it. The mansion they constructed to prove they had arrived became a monument to the cost of arriving. And the land that defeated Ulysses S. Grant, that absorbed the dreams and nightmares of a brewing dynasty, still stands, still opens its gates, still invites strangers to walk through and marvel at what wealth can build and what it cannot protect. There is a question that hangs over Grant's farm, over the Bush family story, over every mansion built by dynasties that rose too fast and fell too hard. What is it all for? What does success mean if it comes with a shadow this dark? What is the point of building an empire if your children and grandchildren cannot escape the weight of it? What is the value of wealth if it isolates you from the very things that make life worth living? These are not abstract questions. They are questions the Bush family lived, whether they asked them aloud or not. August Sr. asked them in his bedroom before he pulled the trigger. Gussie asked them when he buried his daughter and realized no amount of money or power or influence could bring her back. August IV is probably still asking them, sitting in wealth that did not save his girlfriends, did not keep him out of scandals, did not preserve the family control of the company that bore his name. And Grant's farm, the estate built to answer these questions with a resounding, yes, it is worth it, instead became a monument to the complexity. Because the mansion does not give simple answers, it gives contradictions. It gives beauty built on struggle. It gives public generosity funded by private suffering. It gives Clydesdales that make people smile and bedrooms where people chose death. It gives German tradition transported to American soil and American tragedy that feels universal. The land itself seems to resist simple narratives. It was where Grant failed before he succeeded, where the Bush family succeeded before they failed. Where immigrants became aristocrats, where aristocrats became scandals, where wealth built walls and those walls became prisons, where the public was invited in and the private stayed locked away, where celebration and suffering took turns until they became indistinguishable. If Grant's farm teaches anything, it is this. Success is not a destination. It is not a fortress. It is not protection against the chaos of being human. Success is just a different set of problems, a different kind of pressure, a different way to break. The people who visit Grant's farm see the beauty, and they should. It is beautiful, the architecture is stunning. The Clydesdales are majestic, the Bauernhof is charming, the grounds are immaculate, but underneath all that beauty is a truth that the brochures do not advertise. That this place, this monument to the American dream, is also a monument to the American nightmare. The nightmare that says you can have everything and still lose what matters, that you can build a dynasty and watch it crumble, that you can open the gates and still be trapped. The Bush family story is not a cautionary tale in the simple sense. It is not a story that says do not pursue success, or do not build empires, or do not try to rise. America needs people to try. America is built on the backs of people who risked everything to create something from nothing. Adolphus Bush did that. He came to America with almost nothing and built one of the most successful companies in history. That is admirable. That is the story America wants to tell about itself. But the full story, the one that includes August Sr.'s suicide and Gussie's grief, and the deaths that followed August IV and the corporate takeover that ended family control, is a reminder that success has costs. That wealth creates its own kind of suffering. That privilege can become a shield that protects you from small consequences while exposing you to larger tragedies. That when you build something too big, it starts to own you instead of the other way around. And Grant's farm, sitting on those Missouri hills, surrounded by tourists and Clydesdales and memories that will not die, stands as evidence that the American dream is not a lie, but it is not the whole truth either. The whole truth is messier, more complicated, more human. The whole truth is that success and suffering are not opposites. They are partners. And sometimes they build a mansion together and fill it with beautiful things and dark secrets and a history that refuses to be just one story. The mansion still stands, the Clydesdales still parade, the tourists still come, the weddings still happen, life continues, but the ghosts remain, not literal ghosts, just the weight of everything that happened there. The gunshot that ended August Sr.'s life, the grief that broke Gussie. The deaths that followed the heirs, the corporate defeat that ended the dynasty, All of it layered into the walls, into the land, into the story that people tell when they talk about the Bush family and their beautiful, cursed, iconic estate. If you visit Grant's farm, you should enjoy it. You should take photos. You should feed the animals. You should marvel at the Clydesdales. You should walk through the Bauernhof and feel like you have been transported. You should let yourself enjoy the beauty that wealth built. But you should also remember that beauty has a cost, that mansions have shadows, that dynasties have cracks, that the American dream, when stretched across generations, often breaks the people carrying it. And maybe in remembering that, we learn something valuable, not to avoid success, but to hold it lightly, not to reject wealth, but to understand its limits, not to stop building, but to remember that what we build does not define us. That legacy is not just what we leave behind, but how we live. That the mansion matters less than the lives lived inside it. And that in the end, no amount of Clydesdales or Budweiser or baseball teams or European architecture can protect us from the one truth that unites everyone, rich and poor, powerful and weak. That we are all human, we all suffer, we all die. And the only thing that really matters is whether we loved well and lived honestly and treated the people around us with the dignity they deserved. Grant's farm cannot answer that question. The Bush family could not answer it perfectly. No one can. But the mansion stands as a reminder to keep asking, to keep trying, to keep building even when you know that what you build will eventually crumble, because that is what humans do. We build, we hope, we love, we fail, we try again. And sometimes, if we are lucky, we leave behind something beautiful enough that people come to see it long after we are gone, even if they do not know the full story of what it cost to create it. The gates of Grant's farm are still open. The Clydesdales are still beautiful. The mansion is still standing. And the story, for all its darkness, is still worth telling, because it is not just the Bush family's story. It is America's story, the dream and the nightmare, the success and the suffering. The beauty and the cost, all of it true, all of it real, all of it layered into the land where a president once failed and a dynasty rose and fell, and the tourists keep coming, looking for magic, finding history, walking through a place where the American dream built a castle, and then learned that castles do not protect you from being human. If this story moved you, if it made you think about success and suffering differently, if it changed the way you see wealth and legacy and the American dream, then do something with that feeling. Share this story. Talk about it. Visit Grant's farm if you can and walk those grounds knowing the full truth of what happened there. Support the preservation of places like this, not because they are perfect, but because they are honest. Because they tell the complicated truth about who we are and what we build and what it costs. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that go deeper than the surface, that refuse to simplify history into heroes and villains, that treat the American experience with the complexity it deserves, then subscribe. Follow. Share. Because these stories matter. Not because they make us feel good, but because they make us feel real. And in a world that constantly tries to sell us simple narratives and easy answers, the truth, messy and complicated and human, is the most valuable thing we can offer each other. Grant's farm is still there. The Bush family story is still unfolding. And the American dream, for all its beauty and darkness, is still being built by people who do not yet know whether they are creating a monument or a warning. All we can do is watch.